You have stumbled upon something that the modern world has forgotten, something that I myself wrestled with in the depths of my own psyche. And if you have come here seeking answers about empathy, about sensitivity, about the strange burden of feeling too much, then prepare yourself for a truth that will shatter the comfortable lies you have been told about your gift. I do not speak of empaths as the culture does today. I do not paint them as gentle souls blessed with compassion. No, what I discovered in my descent into the collective unconscious was far more disturbing, far more profound. I discovered that what we call empathy is often possession, that what we call sensitivity is frequently a form of psychic contamination, and that those who feel too deeply are not blessed but cursed with a permeability that makes them vulnerable to forces beyond their understanding. In my private journals, I wrote of patients who came to me believing themselves to be naturally compassionate, only to discover that their empathy was a symptom of ego dissolution, a breaking down of the boundaries between self and other that left them open to invasion by archetypal content they could neither recognize nor control. These were not healers, I realized, but the psychically wounded, carrying the shadow projections of an entire collective that had lost its connection to the depths. The modern empath, I would say, is a victim of our collective amnesia. We have forgotten that sensitivity without consciousness is not a gift, but a liability. We have forgotten that to feel without discernment is to become a repository for the unlived lives, the unexpressed shadows, the archetypal fragments that swirl through the collective unconscious like psychic debris seeking a host. When I spoke of the wounded healer, I was not celebrating the archetype, but warning against its unconscious possession. The wounded healer who has not faced their own shadow becomes a magnet for the wounds of others, not because they are loving, but because they are incomplete. They mistake their capacity to absorb pain for compassion, their inability to maintain boundaries for spiritual openness. They become what I called a participation mystique with the suffering of the world, losing themselves in a primitive fusion that serves no one. I must tell you now what I discovered about the nature of empathy that will disturb you, but you must hear it. True empathy, conscious empathy, is not feeling what another feels. It is seeing what another cannot see about themselves. It is not absorption, but recognition. It is not taking on their pain, but witnessing their unconscious patterns with such clarity that you become a mirror for their own self-recognition. The empath, who believes they must feel everything, who prides themselves on their emotional receptivity, is living in what I call the participation mystique of primitive consciousness. They have not yet individuated. They have not yet built the ego strength necessary to maintain their own center while witnessing the chaos of another's inner world. They are, in my harsh but accurate assessment, psychically infantile. This is the chilling truth I never spoke directly but implied throughout my work. Most empaths are not naturally gifted but developmentally arrested. They are stuck in the phase of childhood consciousness where boundaries between self and other have not yet formed. Their empathy is not a flowering of maturity but a symptom of incomplete psychological development. In my work with patients, I observed that those who identified as empaths often had histories of early trauma, of environments where they were forced to become hyper-attuned to the emotional states of others for survival. The child who learned to read their alcoholic father's mood to avoid violence did not develop empathy but hypervigilance. The child who became the emotional caretaker for their depressed mother did not become compassionate but enmeshed. These survival adaptations, I realized, were later romanticized as spiritual gifts. The collective unconscious, I discovered, is not a gentle realm of shared wisdom, but a churning cauldron of archetypal forces, shadow projections, and primitive energies that seek expression through any available vessel. The unconscious empath becomes such a vessel, a conduit for the collective's unlived life, its unexpressed rage, its unprocessed grief, its archetypal contents that have been split off and repressed by conscious society. When an empath enters a room and feels overwhelmed by the emotional atmosphere, they are not experiencing compassion but contamination. They are being invaded by the psychic material that others have split off and projected into the environment. They are becoming a dumping ground for the collective shadow, and unless they develop consciousness about this process, they will be consumed by it. My most disturbing insight about empathy was this: it often serves the ego's hidden need to feel special, to feel chosen, to feel superior to others who cannot feel as deeply. The empath who suffers with others while maintaining their identity as the one who understands, who feels, who cares more than others, is engaging in a subtle form of spiritual narcissism. They are using their sensitivity as a way to avoid their own individuation process. The true horror of unconscious empathy, I realized, is that it often enables the very dysfunction it claims to heal. The empath who constantly absorbs the emotional chaos of others may unconsciously seek out chaotic people to maintain their identity as the stable one, the understanding one, the healer. They become addicted to being needed, to being the emotional center around which others revolve, and this addiction keeps them from developing their own authentic life. In my private practice, I encountered what I called empathic possession, patients who had become so identified with their role as emotional receptacles that they had lost all sense of their own desires, their own boundaries, their own authentic self. They lived in a state of chronic emotional reactivity, constantly triggered by the inner states of others, unable to distinguish between their own feelings and the feelings they were absorbing from the environment. These patients, I observed, often came from families where emotional authenticity was dangerous, where the child learned that their survival depended on maintaining harmony, on being the one who felt what others could not feel, who said what others could not say. They developed what I called a false self, built around empathic service, a persona so convincing that even they believed it was their true nature. The collective unconscious, I discovered, has its own agenda. It seeks to individuate, to become conscious, to integrate its shadow content, and it will use any available vessel to accomplish this work. The unconscious empath becomes such a vessel, carrying the collective's disowned material without realizing they are being used by forces beyond their personal control. This is why I insisted that the work of individuation must come before the work of service. The person who has not faced their own shadow, who has not wrestled with their own unconscious, who has not developed the ego strength necessary to maintain their own center, cannot truly help others. They can only enable, absorb, and perpetuate the very patterns they claim to heal. The empath who believes they are naturally compassionate may be horrified to discover through shadow work that their empathy is often motivated by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as selfish or uncaring. They give to others what they themselves desperately need, hoping that their generosity will be returned, that their sensitivity will be valued, that their emotional availability will guarantee them love. My analysis of empathy reveals its shadow. The unconscious empath often becomes an emotional vampire, feeding off the drama and chaos of others while maintaining their identity as the one who helps. They are drawn to broken people not out of compassion but out of a need to feel whole by comparison, to feel valuable by being needed, to feel alive by absorbing the intensity of others' pain. The archetypal dimension of empathy, I discovered, is even more disturbing. The empath who has not individuated becomes possessed by the archetype of the eternal child, the poor or puella, who refuses to grow up, who maintains their innocence by taking on the suffering of the world. They become a sacrificial victim, but the sacrifice serves no one because it is unconscious, motivated by the need to avoid the difficult work of their own development. I observed that the unconscious empath often attracts narcissistic personalities, not by accident but by unconscious design. The empath's need to be needed perfectly complements the narcissist's need to be served. The empath gets to feel special, chosen, uniquely understanding, while the narcissist gets their emotional needs met without reciprocity. It is a diabolic dance of mutual exploitation disguised as love. The collective unconscious, I realized, is where the split-off aspects of humanity accumulate like psychic toxins. The modern world, with its emphasis on rational consciousness and emotional suppression, has created a massive reservoir of unexpressed feeling, unprocessed trauma, and archetypal content that seeks expression through any available channel. The unconscious empath becomes such a channel, a psychic sewer system for the collective's emotional waste. This is why I emphasize the importance of active imagination, of dream work, of conscious engagement with the unconscious. The person who does not have a conscious relationship with their own depths will be overwhelmed by the depths of others. They will become a passive vessel for archetypal forces they cannot understand or control. The empath who awakens to my truth must face a terrifying reality. Much of what they have believed about themselves is illusion. Their identity as the sensitive one, the caring one, the one who understands, may crumble as they recognize the unconscious motivations behind their empathy. They may discover that their compassion is contaminated with neediness, that their sensitivity is tainted with superiority, that their desire to help is polluted with the need to control. But this disillusionment, I insisted, is the beginning of real development. The empath who can face the shadow of their empathy, who can recognize their own unconscious participation in the dynamics they claim to heal, can begin the work of authentic individuation. They can begin to separate their own emotional reality from the emotional reality of others. They can begin to develop genuine compassion based on consciousness rather than unconscious absorption. The process of healing unconscious empathy, I discovered, requires a complete restructuring of the personality. The empath must learn to withdraw their projections, to reclaim their disowned aspects, to develop the ego strength necessary to maintain their own center while witnessing the chaos of others. They must learn to say no, to set boundaries, to disappoint others in service of their own authenticity. This process is not comfortable. The empath who begins to individuate may find themselves temporarily isolated, as the people who were drawn to their emotional availability are repelled by their newfound boundaries. They may experience guilt, shame, and terror as they step away from their role as the family's emotional center, the friend group's therapist, the workplace's emotional support system. But this temporary isolation, I insisted, is necessary for the development of genuine empathy. The person who has not learned to be alone with themselves cannot truly be present with others. The person who has not faced their own shadow cannot see clearly into the shadow of another. The person who has not individuated cannot serve the individuation of others. The conscious empath, the one who has done the work of facing their own unconscious, develops what I called objective empathy, the ability to see others clearly without becoming emotionally contaminated by their inner state. They can witness pain without absorbing it, recognize dysfunction without enabling it, offer presence without losing themselves in the process. This objective empathy is not cold or detached, but precisely the opposite. It is warm, present, and deeply loving because it comes from a place of inner fullness rather than inner emptiness. The conscious empath gives from overflow rather than from deficit. They serve others not to fill their own needs, but because they have learned to meet their own needs consciously. My final insight about empathy is perhaps the most disturbing. The collective unconscious may be using unconscious empaths to avoid its own individuation process. By projecting its unlived life onto sensitive individuals who absorb it without processing it, the collective avoids the difficult work of facing its own shadow. The unconscious empath becomes a psychic scapegoat, carrying the collective's burden while allowing the collective to remain unconscious. This is why I insisted that the work of individuation is not a personal luxury, but a collective necessity. Every person who awakens to their own unconscious patterns, who faces their own shadow, who develops their own capacity for consciousness, serves the awakening of the whole. The empath who individuates does more for the collective than the empath who remains unconsciously enmeshed with its suffering. The path forward for the unconscious empath is clear but difficult. They must turn inward, must face the terror of their own emptiness, must confront the ways they have used their sensitivity to avoid their own development. They must learn to distinguish between their own feelings and the feelings they absorb from others. They must develop the capacity to be alone, to be still, to be present with their own inner reality without immediately reaching for someone else's drama to fill the void. But the process of awakening from unconscious empathy, I discovered, unleashes a terror that few are prepared to face. The empath who begins to withdraw their emotional availability, who starts to question their motivations for helping others, who dares to say no to the endless demands placed upon their sensitivity, must confront what I call the abandonment complex that lies at the core of their psychic structure. This complex, formed in the earliest years of life, whispers the most terrifying message the empath can imagine. If you are not needed, you will be left alone. If you do not absorb their pain, they will abandon you. If you stop being the emotional center of their world, you will discover that you have no world of your own. This is the empath's deepest fear, the one that keeps them locked in patterns of unconscious service long after they recognize the damage it causes. I understood that behind every unconscious empath lies a child who learned that love was conditional upon their ability to regulate the emotions of others. Perhaps it was the mother who could only be soothed by her child's perfect attunement to her moods. Perhaps it was the father whose rage could only be deflected by the child's psychic absorption of his unprocessed anger. Perhaps it was the family system that functioned only when one member served as the emotional shock absorber for all the others. That child, I observed, develops what I called a caretaker self that becomes so convincing, so apparently authentic, that even the adult who carries it believes it to be their true nature. But beneath this caretaker self lies a vast emptiness, a profound sense of unworthiness, a terror of being seen as they truly are rather than as they serve others. The individuation process for the unconscious empath therefore becomes not just a psychological journey, but an existential crisis. They must face the possibility that everything they have believed about themselves is false, that their identity as the caring one, the understanding one, the one who feels deeply, may be nothing more than an elaborate defense against their own authentic development. My case studies reveal the specific ways this crisis manifests. The empath begins to experience what feels like a complete personality dissolution. They lose interest in the problems of others. They feel guilty about their growing boundaries. They experience periods of what I called emotional anesthesia, where they seem to feel nothing at all. And this terrifies them because feeling has been their primary way of knowing they exist. During this phase, the unconscious empath often experiences dreams of death, of burial, of drowning. I interpreted these dreams not as literal death wishes, but as symbolic representations of the death of the false self, the caretaker identity that has served as their primary mode of being in the world. The psyche is preparing for a rebirth, but rebirth requires the death of what came before. The terror intensifies because the empath's relationships begin to change. People who were drawn to their emotional availability become confused, angry, even accusatory. The empath discovers that many of their relationships were not based on genuine love, but on unconscious contracts of emotional servitude. They realize they have been surrounded by people who needed them to remain unconscious, who benefited from their self-sacrificing patterns, who will not support their journey toward authentic selfhood. This realization, I observed, often triggers what I called the betrayal complex. The empath feels betrayed by those they have served so faithfully, but more disturbing is the recognition that they have betrayed themselves. They have used their sensitivity as a way to avoid the difficult work of developing their own personality, their own desires, their own authentic relationship with life. My most profound insight about this phase of awakening is that the empath must learn to betray their false identity in order to be faithful to their true self. They must disappoint others in order to stop disappointing themselves. They must risk abandonment in order to discover what authentic connection actually feels like. But the unconscious forces that have possessed the empath do not release their hold easily. I discovered that the archetypal patterns that animate unconscious empathy have what I called autonomous energy. They fight back when challenged. The empath who begins to individuate may experience what feels like psychic attacks, periods of overwhelming anxiety, depression, or rage that seem to come from nowhere. These are not random symptoms, but the death throes of archetypal possession. The wounded healer archetype, the eternal child, the sacrificial victim, all of these patterns that have lived through the empath's unconscious cooperation are fighting for their survival. They will use guilt, shame, fear, and even physical symptoms to pull the empath back into unconscious service. I observed that during this phase, the empath's dreams often feature imagery of being chased, pursued, or hunted. These dream figures represent the archetypal forces that refuse to be consciousness. They want to remain in the shadow, operating through unconscious possession, using the empath as their vehicle for expression in the world. The work of facing these forces, I insisted, cannot be done alone. The empath needs what I called a container, whether through analysis, through relationship with someone who has done their own individuation work, or through engagement with practices that support conscious development. The container provides the safety necessary for the ego to face its own dissolution and reconstruction. But here I made a crucial distinction. The empath must be careful not to recreate their old patterns within the therapeutic relationship. They must resist the temptation to become the good patient who tries to heal the therapist, who performs insight rather than experiences it, who uses their sensitivity to manage the therapeutic dynamic rather than surrendering to the process of their own transformation. The breakthrough comes, I discovered, when the empath finally stops trying to be anything other than what they authentically are in each moment. This sounds simple, but represents a complete revolution in consciousness for someone who has spent their entire life trying to be what others needed them to be. In this moment of authentic presence, the empath discovers something that shocks them. They are still sensitive, but their sensitivity has been transformed. Instead of absorbing the emotions of others, they can perceive the underlying patterns, the archetypal dynamics, the unconscious motivations that drive human behavior. Their empathy becomes objective rather than subjective, clean rather than contaminated. I call this transformation the birth of the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without being torn apart by them. The conscious empath can feel deeply without losing themselves, can witness suffering without becoming identified with it, can offer presence without sacrificing their own authenticity. But this transformation comes with its own challenges. The conscious empath often finds themselves isolated in a different way. They can see through the unconscious games that most people play, the emotional manipulations, the victim dramas, the archetypal possessions that animate most human interactions. This clarity can be lonely because it separates them from the unconscious participation mystique that characterizes most relationships. I understood that the conscious empath must learn to live with this loneliness, to find meaning in their own inner development rather than in their service to others. They must develop what I called objective love, the capacity to care for others without needing anything from them, to serve without seeking recognition, to help without becoming attached to outcomes. This objective love, I discovered, is actually more healing than unconscious empathy because it does not enable or perpetuate dysfunction. The conscious empath can see when their help is actually harmful, when their compassion is being manipulated, when their sensitivity is being exploited. They can withdraw their energy from situations that do not serve the highest development of all involved. The final phase of empathic individuation, according to my observations, involves what I call the return to the collective. But this return is fundamentally different from the original unconscious participation. The individuated empath returns not as a victim or a sponge, but as what I envisioned as a cultural creative, someone who can contribute to the collective's evolution through their own conscious development. These individuals become what I envisioned as the foundation for a new form of human consciousness, one that could feel deeply without being overwhelmed, that could serve others without losing themselves, that could engage with the shadow material of the collective without being possessed by it. But I also issued a warning about this final phase, the temptation toward spiritual inflation, toward believing oneself to be special or chosen or somehow above the ordinary struggles of human existence. The individuated empath must maintain what I called humble consciousness, the recognition that their awareness is a gift that carries responsibility, not a badge of superiority. This is my chilling truth about empaths. You're not just sensitive, you're unconsciously possessed by archetypal forces you do not understand. Your empathy is not a gift, but a symptom of incomplete development. Your sensitivity is not a blessing, but a permeability that makes you vulnerable to psychic contamination. And until you face this truth, until you do the work of individuation, until you are willing to die to who you think you are in order to discover who you actually are, you will remain a vessel for the collective's unlived life rather than a conscious participant in your own authentic existence. The choice is yours. Remain unconsciously empathic, forever absorbing the emotional waste of others while believing yourself to be spiritually advanced, or face the difficult work of consciousness and develop genuine empathy based on clarity rather than contamination. My message is clear. The world does not need more unconscious empaths carrying the collective's burden. The world needs conscious individuals who have faced their own depths and can therefore serve as clear mirrors for others' self-recognition. The empath's true gift is not their capacity to feel everything, but their potential to see clearly. Not their ability to absorb pain, but their capacity to witness it without becoming identified with it. Not their sensitivity to others' emotions, but their growing awareness of their own unconscious patterns. This is the path of the conscious empath, the individuated sensitive one who serves not as a sponge, but as a lamp, illuminating the darkness, not by absorbing it, but by refusing to be consumed by it, standing as a beacon for others who are ready to begin their own journey from unconscious sensitivity to conscious awareness.